So we've been talking about memory, and you guys can all see the PowerPoint. Okay, great. Let me just move chats so I can maybe see them. Okay. All right. Okay, so I remember we talked about the encoding specificity principle, and I wanted to clarify that. It is partly that the information matches information that you've looked at before, but it's also the idea that if you take an exam or have to recall the information in a place where you learned the information or rehearsed the information, you're more likely to be able to remember it. That's called the encoding specificity principle. So a cue will be more effective if you encoded it in the same place or the same situation, or the same with the same information around where you remembered it. There's an example in the clip that we're going to watch, or there was an example in some clip that I watched before class, of if you learned something while you were drunk, you're more likely to remember it while you're drunk. I'm not encouraging you to get drunk. I'm just telling you that that's an example, and I felt like you might remember that example. Why is it? Okay, so I have a clip on how we make memories.
Professor,
Uh-huh.
I can only see the 8675309.
It's still not moving. That's so weird. Well, anyway, I'm going to stop share and go to a clip. So that ought to fix it. Thanks for telling me. So weird. Okay. Can you see the could you imagine? Can you see the YouTube page? No. What the heck's going on? Oh, wait. Now can you? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
Clive Waring was playing the piano alone in his room. When his wife came into the room, he immediately leapt up and embraced her with joyful enthusiasm. A little later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare herpes encephalitis virus that ravaged his central nervous system. Since then, he's been unable to remember almost any of his past or to make new memories. His wife is the only person he recognizes, but he can never recall the last time he saw her. This may be the most profound case of extreme and chronic amnesia ever recorded. Our memory helps make us who we are, whether recognizing loved ones, recalling past joys, or just remembering how to walk and talk and fry an egg. Memory is the chain that connects our past to our present. If it breaks, we're left untethered, incapable of leaving the present moment, and unable to embrace the future. But memory isn't an all or nothing thing, of course. Waring can't remember any details about his personal past, but he still remembers how to speak English and get dressed and play the piano. Some memories you process automatically, and they are stored differently than your more personal or factual memories, like your first kiss, or how to recite pi to 12 places, or who won the Peloponnesian War. Speaking of ancient Greeks, and to help demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want you to have a look at our Spartan friend here and remember his name, because we're going to be testing your memory in just a minute. Technically, memory is learning that has persisted over time, information that has been stored and in many cases can be recalled. Except, of course, during the exam, our memories are typically accessed in 3 different ways: through recall, recognition, and relearning. And if you think about all the different kinds of tests you've taken in school, they're all actually designed to size up how you access stored information in these ways. Like recall is how you reach back into your mind and bring up information just as you do in fill in the blank tests. So if I say blank is the capital of Greece, your brain hopefully would just recall the answer as Athens. Recognition, meanwhile, is more like multiple choice test. You only need to identify old information when presented with it, as in which of the following was not an ancient city in Greece: Athens, Marathon, Pompeii, or Sparta. And relearning is sort of like refreshing or reinforcing old information. So when you study for a final exam, you relearn things you half forgot more easily than you did when you were first learning them, like, say, a basic timeline of the Greek Empire. But how? How does all of that data that we're exposed to all the time, every day, become memory? Well, in the late 1960s, American psychologists Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin figured out enough about the process of memory formation to break it down into 3 stages. First, it's encoded into the brain, then stored for future use, and then eventually retrieved. Sounds simple, but by now you've figured out that just because you take a lot of stuff about your mind for granted doesn't mean that it is not complicated. By Atkinson and Schifrin's model, we first record things we want to remember as an immediate but fleeting sensory memory. Think back to the image I showed you a minute ago. You remember his name? If you do, it's because you successfully managed to shuffle it into your short-term memory, where you probably encoded it through rehearsal. This is how you briefly remember something like a password or phone number. Like, hey Tommy, what's Jenny's number? Okay, 867 5309. 867 5309. 867 5309. You're getting it in your head there. Or in this case, I told you to remember that guy's name. Maybe you were thinking Leonidas repeatedly over and over, even if you didn't think you were doing it. But this information really only stays in your short-term memory for under 30 seconds without a lot of rehearsal. So if you weren't repeating Leonidas, you probably have forgotten it already. Because your mind, amazing as it is, can really only hold between 4 and 7 distinct bits of information at a time, at which point the memory either decays or it gets transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory is your brain's like durable and ridiculously spacious storage unit holding all of your knowledge, skills, and experiences. Now, since the days of Atkinson and Schifrin, psychologists have recognized that the classical definition of short-term memory didn't really capture all of the processes involved in the transfer of information to your long-term memory. I mean, it's more than being able to just remember some Greek guy's name. So later generations of psychologists revisited the whole idea of short-term memory and updated it to the more comprehensive concept of working memory. Working memory involves all the ways that we take short-term information and stash it in our long-term stores, and increasingly we think of it as involving both explicit and implicit processes. When we store information consciously and actively, that's an explicit process. We make the most of this aspect of working memory when we study, for instance, so that we can know that Athens is the capital of Greece and that Pompeii was a Roman town and not a Greek one. This is how we capture facts and knowledge that we think we're going to need. Like I told you, specifically to remember Leonidas's name, you concentrated on that detail and filed it away, if briefly. But of course, we're not conscious of every tiny thing that we take in, yet our working memory often transfers stuff we're not aware of to long-term storage. We call that an implicit process, the kind you don't have to actively concentrate on. A good example might be classically conditioned associations, like if you get all sweaty and nervous at the dentist because you had a root canal last year. You don't need to pull up that file on the last time you got your face drilled on to think, oh, oral surgery, not my favorite. Instead, implicit processes cover all that stuff automatically. This kind of automatic processing is hard to shut off. Unless you got something unusual going on in your brain, you might not have much choice but to learn this way, like how you learned how to not put your hand into a fire. That learning would have happened pretty much automatically as soon as you first yanked your hand away from an open flame. Whether those things are lodged in there explicitly or implicitly or both, there are also different kinds of long-term memory. For instance, procedural memory refers to how we remember to do things like riding a bike or reading. It's effortful to learn it first, but eventually you can do it without thinking about it. Long-term memory can also be episodic, tied to specific episodes of your life. Like remember that time that Bernice fell out of her chair at chemistry and everybody started laughing uncontrollably? Man, good times. There are other types of long-term memory too, and we're continually learning more about the biology and psychology of the whole complex phenomenon. For instance, while Clive Waring's episode episodic memories, among others, seem to be deeply affected, his procedural memories for things seem to be in one piece. This has to do with neuroanatomy that we do not have time to explore here and that we don't yet fully understand. Waring and others have a lot to teach us about the different types of long-term memory storage. Now, for healthy memories, there are lots of little tricks you can use to help remember information. Mnemonics, for one, help with memorization, and I'm sure you know a few that take the form of acronyms. Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, for instance. Mnemonics work in part by organizing items into familiar, manageable units in a process called chunking. For example, it may be hard to recall a 7-digit number, but it'll be easier to commit to memory in the rhythm of a phone number, 867-5309, or you could just write a song about it. Strategies like mnemonics and chunking can help you with explicit processes, but how well you retain your data can depend on how deep you dig through the different levels of processing. Shallow processing, for instance, lets you encode information on really basic auditory or visual levels based on the sound, structure, or appearance of a word. So if you're trying to commit the name Leonidas to your explicit memory using shallow processing, you might encode the word by recalling the cool font you saw it in. But to really retain that information, you want to activate your deep processing, which encodes semantically based on actual meaning associated with the word. In this case, you might remember the story of that mega tough yet very scantily clad warrior of ancient Greece. Or you might remember that Leon means lion in Greek, and that lions are tough fighters, and that Leonidas was a tough Spartan warrior king. And then to really make it stick, you want to connect it to something meaningful or related to your own personal emotional experience. Like maybe Gerard Butler's bronzed 8-pack torso and unconquerable bloodlust helped lock down the word Spartan and Leonidas in your memory forever. I mean, maybe, if that helps you. In the end, how much information you encode and remember depends on both the time you took to learn it and how you made it personally relevant to you. Memory is extremely powerful.
Okay, so
it's constantly shaping and
sorry, were you able to remember Leonidas? And how did you do it?
I kept saying the name over and over in my head.
You said the name over and over? Okay, so that's like auditory rehearsal. Anybody else have a different way that they did it?
Well, I thought of like Lion or Leonidas from Sparta. So
That was one of the examples he gave. My dad's name is Leonard, so that was easy. Right? Did anybody use another personal thing to remember it?
I didn't use something personal, but the way I remember things is by like writing them down multiple times.
Okay. Yeah, that's how I studied for my comprehensive exams in grad school, and I had like a huge bloody callus on this finger. Any other ways?
Can I just add something like pretty random?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So there's a show on Netflix called The Mind Explained.
Yeah, I show clips from that sometimes.
Yeah, so I guess just watching it just made me remember this one girl, like when 9/11 happened, she was in Connecticut and she claims like she saw like the smoke. But there's no way like you could see the smoke from like Connecticut. But in her memory, like she remembers like seeing the smoke and everything, but in reality, like that did not happen. So I guess my question is how like our memories change, I guess, almost, right? So how does that, like, remembering things, like, are we actually remembering them, or are we like, is it just something we kind of just make up along the way?
Well, they're influenced a lot by, retelling, and they're influenced a lot by emotion. So you might have zero memory of something that happened in your early childhood, but you might feel like you have a really detailed memory of it because you've been told the story so many times. And then people's memories of things change over the years too. Like my mother's 82, and stories that we agreed on 20 years ago, we don't agree on now because her memory has changed. you know, so, and then there's the effect of suggestibility. You know, people in the, like Freud and people who he worked with used to hypnotize people to try to get at their earliest memories or their unconscious conflicts. And some psychoanalytic therapists who are kind of Freudian still try to hypnotize people to get at what their unconscious conflicts are. In 1996, the American Psychological Association issued a statement urging therapists not to use that technique anymore because people are so suggestible under hypnosis. They're so kind of loose that they might kind of say anything. It gets people talking. It doesn't necessarily get people saying the true history. So you could effectively implant a false memory into somebody's mind by doing hypnosis. The same thing with the so-called truth serums that they sometimes give people, or they used to in like the 90s and maybe the early 2000s, to try to get to the truth about a criminal act, right? It gets people talking, but you don't know if it's just, you know, grist for the mill or truth. You know, like just any talking isn't necessarily what you want to know. You want to know what actually happened, right? So I think that's what happens. So yeah, they change over time like our brains do, right? And there's interference effects, things you learn after the fact, totally mess with your memory, right? And you probably know that when you're studying for 2 tests at the same time, right? On the same day. You feel like you've got a certain amount of storage. So your retrieval of one of the things you study for suffers because of new information in your brain. That can be really frustrating. Let me just see. I don't know if there's more in this clip.
Shaping your brain, your life, and your identity. Clive Waring is still himself on the outside, but in his inability to recall who he was or process what has happened, he has lost some critically important part of himself. Our memories may haunt us or sustain us, but either way, they define us. Without them, we are left to wander alone in the dark. If you were committing this lesson to memory, you learn about how we encode and store in memory, the difference between implicit automatic and effortful explicit processing, how shallow and deep processing work, and a few types of long-term storage. Thank you for watching, especially to our subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible.
Oh.
If you'd like to sponsor an
Stop
episode of
sharing
Crash
it, but I
Course, get a
didn't
special...
pause it. Okay. Okay, so there are a few different things that I think we've relearned, right? Because I touched on most of these things last time, but in case I wasn't perfectly clear, it's always good to go over them. And when you go over something, that's relearning, assuming that you understood it and some portion of it went into your short-term memory the first time. And so the reason you rehearse things over and over is so it goes into your long-term memory. Even if you know, cram for an exam the night before, you're trying to get it into your long-term memory. You're trying to get it to last more than, you know, a few minutes, right? So one of the things I wanted to ask about was, you know, the difference between recall and recognition. That can change how hard an exam is, right? Probably a lot of you find multiple choice tests, you know, plenty difficult, right? But think about the difference between if I said, which of the following is declarative memory? A, B, C, or D. And I had one of those was the definition of declarative memory. Or I said, define declarative memory. Which one would be harder for you to do you think? I mean, I think
Would it
this,
be
uh-huh.
the multiple choice?
No, I think, well, maybe, maybe for you, it depends on the question, obviously, and how I word the multiple choice and how closely the correct answer is, how similar that is to the incorrect answer. But I think it's harder to come up with a correct definition than to recognize a correct definition that I've provided, right? And so recall, that would be recall. If you have to just come up with something and write it out and explain it yourself. And then recognition is just what it sounds like. It's recognizing which is the right answer. So you don't have to produce the right answer. You just have to recognize it, right? So in an essay exam, you have to recall everything and produce it. In a multiple choice exam, you just have to recognize it. Like, do you ever not quite remember the name of a term? And then you get a multiple choice question that says, which of the following is declarative memory? But you never would have been able to remember what it is if they hadn't given you the term in the stem of the question. That's why recognition is easier, right? And that's the difference between recall and recognition. And then, so if I said, which of the following is, match up which of the following is explicit memory and which is implicit memory, it might be easier than an essay that said, compare and contrast explicit and implicit memory, right? Remember, explicit, think about explicit instructions or even the prefix X for explain, right? Explicit memory means it's effortful, right? You have to try to remember it. And then implicit memory means it's just in there. It's automatic, right? It just happens, right? So can somebody give me an example of explicit or implicit memory? Or one of the ones he gave. Grace.
An example of like an implicit, wouldn't it be like singing a song that you're like familiar to or something like that?
Yeah. If you've just heard it so many times and you didn't have to try and you just start singing along, it's something that just happens that requires no effort at all. That changes over time too. It requires more effort to remember things when you're older than it does at your age. That's why that's one of the reasons that you go to school and graduate school at a young age. It's good to do that now. Like, thank God all this stuff is in my long-term memory and I can just retrieve it. Because if I had to learn it now, it'd be a lot harder. I'd have to do a lot more rehearsal. Now it's way easier for you guys to get it in there than it is for older people, no matter how smart we are. All right, how about something that is effortful to remember? Is anybody having trouble remembering something in one of their classes?
Yeah, like math formulas for an exam.
Yeah, math formulas, that just doesn't, it's not like you see it once and it just rolls off the tongue, right? You have to memorize those. That's explicit, right? Whereas, in the beginning of learning how to ride a bike, it's hard. Then over time, they say it's like riding a bike, you never forget how to do it. By that time, it's implicit. At the beginning, it's explicit. You have to work at it. And then over time, it's implicit. Okay. And do you guys use mnemonics or chunking for anything? Can you remember a thing that you made up yourself to remember something?
I never made up one, but I know Roy G. Biv.
Yeah.
That was for like the rainbow.
Right.
Or
There's a little song too.
PEMDAS.
Huh?
PEMDAS, like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for math. Like,
Oh.
how you do, like,
Oh, parentheses,
yeah.
addition, right? Multiplication. Yeah. Yeah. So knowing the order of operations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Those
like,
are mnemonics.
and north, south, east, and west, like, never eat soggy waffles.
Oh, what's
Like,
that?
when we were kids, everyone learned something. I don't know. That's what I remember.
Soggy waffles. What does it stand for?
So north, south, east, and west. That's how I remembered.
Oh,
When I was a kid, that's what they
cute.
taught me. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember just like if I didn't feel like writing a list and I was going into a store, I'd just remember the first initial of each thing and try to make a word out of it, things like that. Those are mnemonics. Or if you chunk something, chunking is just like making a pattern out of it. So if you're like apples, milk, oranges, bread, waffles, bagels, you know what I mean? And you just rehearse it in a pattern, that's chunking. All right. So I'm going to show you a clip of Clive Waring. He's the guy who he had, I think it was herpes viral encephalitis. So it's a virus that infects your brain and it destroyed the part of his brain responsible for memory, or parts of his brain responsible for memory. And it didn't affect his procedural memory, but it affected his, episodic memory, his memory for things that happened in his life. So can you see the YouTube window or no? I think I have to stop and start again. Oh, that's that.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence. I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently in New Zealand. And so they're having a party.
Funny how the ladies acquire different titles when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married. And do you know what country she just got married in?
No.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question and he'll give you an answer. But while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is. I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You want to see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to
No,
now?
no.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea. I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They haven't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I don't know what possible thing they could do, do they?
Yeah.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. Don't know where I am.
Yeah. All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before. Never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive. Day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, she's come.
Oh, wonderful.
That's a very musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part of the room I'm standing in.
Can we dog?
In over 100 years, we've never missed a payment.
Okay. Oh, wait.
Guaranteed monthly income for life.
I don't know if there was any more. I can't see the whole screen. Oh, okay, now. Okay, stop share. Okay, so what were some of the types of things you think you might remember?
How to play piano.
How to play piano. And does anybody remember the name of that kind of memory? Or one of the names for it?
Procedural?
Yeah, it's a procedural memory. You know, it takes effort at first, and then for him, it probably still takes some effort. It's become less effortful for him, and it didn't go away, right? So some of his procedural memories have not gone, right? Or most of them. He knows how to get dressed, right? So what other things might he know how to do?
Like brushing his teeth or brushing his hair, even probably showering.
Yeah, like all the daily living skills, we call them in clinical psychology, you know, all the things that you work on if someone has like a psychotic disorder or something that interferes with their hygiene, you know, making sure they're taking care of themselves, cleaning their apartment or home, right? So what's the type of memory he's completely lost?
His explicit?
Hmm?
Isn't it his explicit?
Well, explicit is things that take effort to learn. So he has, you know, he has remembered how to play piano. So that did take effort to learn. So he still has some of that, right? But he's probably lost, it probably took him, you know, explicit memory is things like learning people's names, and he only remembers his wife's name. So he has lost a lot of explicit memories too. But not all of them, right? But most of them, or many of them. But what's the opposite of procedural memory?
Episodic memory?
Yeah, episodic memory. So the things like things that have happened in his life, having his daughter, right? You know, things around that. And what happens every time he sees his wife?
He embraces her with so much love.
Yeah, he's like completely joyful as though he hasn't seen her in months, right? Because why is that? Why is it like so joyful?
That's one of his best memories he has.
Yeah, and like she's the only person he knows. So it's kind of a lonely existence. Like imagine if you only lived in the present, right? And so any moment that you're alone or with someone you don't know, that's all you know. And then suddenly you're presented with the only person you're close to or you know, and you have a good relationship with them. How great that would be, because your only experience of existence has been alone or with people you don't know. So it's like you've been in isolation your whole kind of conscious life. And then you see, you know, your loved one, your only loved one. So it must be kind of exhausting for her, because every time she leaves and comes back into the room, it's this reunion, right? I mean, it's pleasant, but you know, can you imagine like 20 times a day, right? Okay. And you saw how he would forget what she told him by the end of a sentence, right? Because your kind of sensory memory, it only lasts between like 5 or 7 to 30 seconds, right? So if the sentence is longer than that, it's already gone. So he forgot that his daughter, somebody was getting married, in New Zealand, right? By the end of the, very shortly into the conversation. My brother's a clinical neuropsychologist, and he studied memory a lot. And he went to a conference where somebody had a lot of damage to their short-term memory, but not quite as much as Clive Waring. So he had a memorized talk, and it was really good. But about 20 minutes in, he started over and gave the same exact lecture starting from the beginning. And you never knew like when he was going to restart the lecture, but he would forget that he had already started it. Okay.
All right,
So
I have
what
a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is like
Okay.
random again, but
Oh,
so
good.
would you say memory is real? Because isn't it just like based on how you feel? Like you're only gonna like I feel like everything is based on what you're telling yourself in your head. So if you experience something with somebody else and two people were there, like one person that had a bad experience there is gonna remember it one way and somebody else is gonna remember it another way. So is what actually happened, like the memory of how it happened, real? Or
Wow. That's very philosophical. And like in the 70s, there were a lot of therapists and psychologists. I think Timothy Leary might have been one of them, that guy who thought you should take LSD to like open your mind. Um, he thought, and other people argued, that there's no such thing as schizophrenia or psychosis, because who is anyone to say what reality is? And if that's the case, then who is anyone to say what a correct memory is? But what we go by is what the vast majority of people agree upon is happening, or what we're seeing, or what we remember. So it's not ideal, it's not completely accurate, but it's the best we can do. And we have things to record things like, we have video, and we have audio, and we have photographs and things like that. So that helps us make more accurate recordings and compare people's memories with them. And that's like a lot of what is done in study of memory. They'll show people things like pictures or, videoed scenes, and then show them other pictures and say, what are some of the things that you saw in the last picture that are in this picture too? And you'll see how horrible eyewitness recollections are. Because if you show people like a picnic scene, they think they saw a picnic basket, they think they saw cookies, they think they saw lemonade, and they didn't. They were just suggested. It goes back to suggestibility. So you're right, it can be very inaccurate. But it's better than nothing. And sometimes it's the only thing that people who work in, solving crimes have. Right. But so that's why there's cameras everywhere now, right? Especially in some particularly high crime areas. Right. Okay, so I have a video of the exact opposite of this. Of course, unfortunately, there are far more cases of amnesia than there are of people who have perfect memory. There are some people who have perfect episodic memory, but that's only there's only 10 known cases in the world. So I'm going to show you some of those people. Let me go back to PowerPoint. And I have to share screen.
Imagine being able to.
So stop share screen, YouTube. Share. I don't have good episodic memory or procedural memory for how to do this. Okay. You can see her, right? Okay, awesome.
Remember every minute detail of your life. You can recall what the weather was like, what you were reading, or what you wore to the shops at any minute, any hour, or any day stretching back decades. It sounds like some kind of parlor trick, but it's actually a real and very rare medical phenomenon. So far, scientists have identified 10 cases worldwide. And believe me, what these people can do will quite simply make your head spin. Take a ride with me down memory lane with veteran Hollywood actress Mary-Lou Henner.
July 22nd of 1978. Here we go again. My first apartment that I moved into was 100 South Doheny, right down the street.
So driving along, all these
different little things. Yeah, for sure.
Mary-Lou is no stranger to the limelight.
Let's have another warm landing welcome for Mary-Lou Henner.
In the 1970s, she starred in the sitcom Taxi.
See, I'd really like to have one person there that I don't care about impressing.
But among her family and friends, Mary-Lou Henner has always been famous for remembering everything.
Hey, Mom, what day was Valentine's Day in '79?
It was a Wednesday.
And you're right. I've never explained how you do it.
I don't do it. I just see it.
And you can remember your whole life.
Yes, I can remember my whole life. And some things come up like right away. And then some other things kind of come up a little more slowly, but eventually everything comes up.
I thought I'd see just how far back Mary-Lou's memory goes.
Then by all means, just come to my party.
Picking at random an episode of Taxi filmed more than 30 years ago.
Thank you very much.
I had a look at the Taxi episode from 1978, Come As You Aren't. Do you remember?
Oh, that was the 4th episode that we shot, and I had the blue dress on.
So that was going to be my first question to you.
What
Do you
dress?
remember what colour dress you wore to the party?
Yes.
So
And, and I remember Tony's line, how come we can't go to the party too?
How come we can't go to the party too?
You know, it's like things come back. A line to Alex, you're maybe my best friend.
You're maybe my best friend.
And he turns around, and, you know, it's like the episode will come back to me. And I remember
Mary-Lou is one of just 10 people in the world who've been tested and proved to have superior autobiographical memory.
October 1st, 8th.
Total recall of every day of their lives.
Extremely impressive.
Delta Airline Flight 191 crashes near Dallas, Texas.
Oh, I know exactly when that happened because it was August the 2nd of 1985. It was a Friday.
Such a gift has never been documented before. And scientists like Professor James McGaw are excited about where it may lead.
One of them said it's like a Google search, that you put it in and it just sort of, and there it is. And it's the year and it's the month and it's the day and it sort of narrows in and it goes bang and they've got it. And this all happens very quickly. It just, there you have it.
That's how they explain to you how they do it.
Yeah, it's not a scientific explanation.
I understood it though.
It really is like selected scenes on a DVD.
So how does it work? If I throw you a random date, say the 8th of September, 1985.
Okay, so I know the 8th of September, 1985 was a Sunday. It's like 85 all of a sudden kind of lines itself up and it gets completely organized sort of in a timeline way. And I see the whole calendar sort of fall into place.
It's an extraordinary skill and one that Mary-Lou is thrilled to have.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct, but it's wordy and hard.
Okay, so that'd be a handy little skill to have, wouldn't it? But they showed somebody else who had it, who had traumatic events in her life, and she hated having it The other thing was there were too many kind of reminders of specific dates and specific events on specific dates that it was overstimulating. And a lot of, like pretty much all of the people who have this kind of memory, there's 10, you know, and I think it was all of them, also have really detailed records. It's a way for them to kind of get it on paper so it's not like swirling around their heads all the time. But the research has shown, I mean, there's not like a ton of research on it, of course, but they've done MRIs, you know, they've done imaging of all the 10 people who have this ability. And they found that this part of the brain, the caudate nucleus, is like up to 7 times bigger. They're huge in people who have this ability. So it's really interesting because the parts of the brain that we've learned have, you know, a huge role in memory are the are the hippocampus, right? The amygdala, which is kind of connected to the caudate nucleus, and here the cerebellum, right? So I think like the larger this caudate nucleus is, the closer it is to the parts of the limbic system that are implicated in memory, right? And it's also close to the parts of the limbic system that are implicated in visual memory. And that's how they report remembering things. It's like it really quickly comes up and they see it just effortlessly. So be nice if we could all just kind of like work out and make a bigger caudate nucleus, wouldn't it? You wouldn't have to really study, you know? You could, if you had seen it once, you wouldn't have to do rehearsal. It would just be retrievable without effort, right? But for some people, it's unbearable. And for Mary Lou Henner, it was, you know, fun. She had a good life. So her memories that would come up were mostly positive. And everybody asked her, everybody would ask people, what about breakups? What about horrible breakups? And she said that, you know, she had closure on them so that it wasn't so distressing to have kind of the equivalent of a flashback about them. So, all right, well, we'll stop there. I hope you guys have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.